There are places on this planet that were never designed to welcome attention, let alone visitors, and the most unsettling thing about them is not what they hide, but how calmly they exist without needing us to notice at all. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. They do not announce danger, they do not perform mystery, and they certainly do not explain themselves because explanation has never been part of their function. These places do not raise alarms when approached, nor do they whisper invitations when ignored, and that quiet indifference tends to bother us more than any warning sign ever could because we are deeply uncomfortable with spaces that do not care whether we arrive or not. Across the world, such locations appear again and again, scattered not by accident but by intention, resting inside mountains where light arrives reluctantly, buried beneath layers of earth that have learned patience over centuries, or positioned on distant islands where distance itself becomes the most reliable form of security. They are not hidden in the romantic sense, and they are not lost to history because being forgotten was never their goal. Instead, they exist in a state of deliberate separation, maintained not by myth or fear, but by routine, infrastructure, and a quiet agreement that proximity is neither required nor encouraged. What makes these places particularly effective is that they rarely forbid entry directly because prohibition invites curiosity, while access, carefully managed and endlessly delayed, tends to exhaust it. Barriers are not dramatic walls topped with warnings, but fences that look administrative, checkpoints that feel procedural, and schedules that stretch indefinitely forward without urgency. Control here is not theatrical. It is systematic, polite, and persistent, operating at a pace that makes resistance feel unnecessary and intrusion feel oddly inappropriate, as if showing up would be less a rebellion and more a breach of etiquette. Tonight there will be no attempt to cross these thresholds, no urge to test boundaries, no fantasy of forbidden passage, because this is not a story about infiltration or confrontation. Instead, this is an exercise in distance, in learning how to observe places that were never meant to be entered, only maintained, monitored, and left alone. We will remain outside not because we are prevented from going further, but because standing back turns out to be the most honest way to understand how these spaces actually function. When viewed from afar, patterns begin to emerge, revealing that these locations share a common logic despite their varied geography and purpose. They are defined less by what they contain than by how they regulate presence, deciding who may approach, who must remain distant, and who is never meant to be considered at all. This regulation is rarely emotional and never impulsive. It is methodical, repeated daily, and enforced through systems that value predictability over drama, a design philosophy that prioritizes continuity above spectacle. There is something quietly ironic in how much effort goes into maintaining places that discourage engagement, because their existence depends entirely on attention that never becomes intimacy. Satellites track them, guards patrol them, records catalog them, and budgets sustain them, yet the average person is expected to accept their presence without ever interacting with them meaningfully. These are places everyone knows exist, but almost no one is supposed to experience, and that contradiction sits comfortably within modern systems that excel at separating awareness from access. In many cases, these locations are framed as necessary, not remarkable, and certainly not personal. They are introduced through language that emphasizes function, security, or containment, terms that sound reassuring precisely because they avoid specificity. Nothing is ever described in detail because detail invites interpretation, and interpretation invites questions, which are inconvenient when a place is meant to operate without explanation. Over time, the absence of narrative becomes the narrative, and silence becomes not a gap, but a feature. As we ease further into this quiet landscape, it becomes clear that these spaces are not anomalies, but refinements, products of societies that have learned how to manage unease by organizing it spatially. Instead of resolving uncertainty, they relocate it, storing it behind controlled distances and administrative layers, where it can exist without demanding resolution. The result is a geography of restraint, a map dotted with locations whose primary purpose is not activity, but containment of attention itself. Interestingly, these places often appear most calm on the surface, with surroundings that look orderly, even mundane, which is precisely what allows them to persist without drawing focus. A gate that opens on schedule, a road that ends without explanation, a structure that blends into its environment just enough to avoid curiosity, all contribute to an atmosphere where nothing feels urgent and nothing feels inviting. The absence of urgency is not accidental. It is carefully cultivated because urgency suggests relevance, and relevance invites scrutiny. From a distance, the design choices become easier to read, revealing how architecture, geography, and procedure work together to discourage emotional engagement. Sharp edges are avoided, dramatic silhouettes softened, and visual language kept deliberately neutral, ensuring that the space communicates function rather than symbolism. These are not places that want to be remembered vividly, only accurately, and even accuracy is often reduced to a label on a map or a line in a report. There is a subtle humor in how thoroughly these environments anticipate human curiosity while never acknowledging it directly. Signs are minimal, instructions vague, and responses delayed just enough to make persistence feel unnecessary. Nothing here says no outright, but everything gently implies later, elsewhere, or not required. Over time, this strategy proves remarkably effective as curiosity fades not through confrontation, but through exhaustion, leaving behind a quiet acceptance that some spaces simply operate without us. As the night settles and the pace slows, the story does not build toward revelation or entry, because the point is not what happens inside these places, but how little needs to happen for them to continue existing exactly as intended. Their power lies in consistency, in the reliable repetition of distance, routine, and restraint, forming a rhythm that feels stable enough to ignore and persistent enough to endure. For now, we remain where we are, observing without advancing, listening without interpreting too deeply, allowing these places to remain what they have always been, not mysteries demanding answers, but structures content to exist without participation. In doing so, we begin to understand that the most guarded places in the world are not defined by what they hide, but by how comfortably they remain untouched, quietly reminding us that presence is not always required for significance, and that sometimes distance is the most deliberate design choice of all. The mountain kept quiet. In the wide and patient spine of the Ural Mountains, where geography rarely competes for attention and landscapes seem content with repetition, there stands a mountain that looks as though it has practiced being overlooked for a very long time. Mount Yamantau does not dominate postcards, it does not rise dramatically above its neighbors, and it does not reward casual curiosity with obvious spectacle, which may be precisely why it works so well as a place that prefers not to be noticed. From the outside, it appears cooperative, even modest, offering nothing that suggests importance, urgency, or intrigue. And in a world increasingly addicted to visible significance, that restraint is already a kind of statement. The surrounding terrain does not help visitors build expectations either, because it follows the familiar rhythm of the Urals, where forests stretch with quiet confidence, weather behaves according to habit rather than drama, and roads tend to stop where interest does. There are no scenic pull-offs inviting photographs, no interpretive signs explaining what one should feel, and no narrative cues that hint at hidden grandeur which leaves the mountain free to remain what it appears to be, an unremarkable rise of stone in a range that has seen far more attention than it ever asked for. And yet, beneath this practiced ordinariness, the story becomes less about elevation and more about administration, because the area surrounding Yamantau has long been defined not by what is visible, but by how access is managed. Entry is not encouraged, movement is not casual, and presence is never spontaneous, creating a controlled environment that does not rely on secrecy so much as procedure. Roads exist, but not for wandering. Checkpoints function without theatrics, and boundaries are enforced with a consistency that suggests routine rather than alarm, as though the mountain were less a destination and more a long-term project that simply continues because it always has. Over the years, construction activity around the mountain has been observed with a patience that mirrors the landscape itself, unfolding steadily without announcements or conclusions, neither rushed nor abandoned, but maintained with the confidence of something that expects no audience. Equipment arrives, infrastructure evolves, and work continues according to schedules that are never explained publicly, which is perhaps the most telling detail of all. Nothing here seems designed to convince, reassure, or impress, because persuasion would imply a need to be understood, and understanding has never been part of the arrangement. Official statements regarding Yamantau, when they appear at all, tend to be minimal, functional, and carefully unambitious, offering explanations that feel complete precisely because they refuse to elaborate. There is a quiet elegance to this approach, as though the absence of detail were not a lack, but a finished product, leaving little room for interpretation and even less incentive for debate. The mountain is framed not as a mystery, but as a managed space, and management, unlike mystery, does not invite storytelling. What makes this particularly effective is how thoroughly the mountain avoids emotional framing, because nothing around it asks for fear, fascination, or admiration. Instead, it encourages neutrality, a state in which curiosity gradually loses momentum and speculation becomes tiring rather than thrilling. When a place neither denies nor confirms anything of interest, it becomes difficult to maintain enthusiasm, and over time attention drifts elsewhere, leaving the system intact and largely undisturbed. There is a subtle irony in how much effort appears to be invested in maintaining a location that resists engagement, because the systems that support it are extensive, precise, and persistent. Security is present, without being visible. Oversight is constant without being discussed. And continuity is valued above all else, creating an environment where change feels unnecessary and explanation feels optional. In this sense, the mountain does not so much hide something as it hides the act of hiding itself, which is a far more sustainable strategy. From a distance, Yamantau becomes less a geographical feature and more a lesson in how modern control operates most comfortably when it feels boring. The absence of spectacle is not an oversight, but a design choice, because spectacle attracts questions, and questions require answers, and answers introduce variables that are best avoided. By remaining visually and narratively unremarkable, the mountain achieves a kind of invisibility that does not depend on secrecy but on indifference. This approach reflects a broader pattern seen in places that are meant to endure rather than explain themselves, where longevity is prioritized over clarity and routine replaces narrative. The mountain does not need to justify its continued activity because it exists within a framework that assumes its own legitimacy, supported by infrastructure, schedules, and authority that function quietly in the background. In such systems, the lack of information is not a gap waiting to be filled, but a boundary that has already been defined. Even the nearby settlements, sparse and carefully regulated, contribute to this atmosphere of managed distance, existing not as communities oriented toward the mountain, but as components within a larger logistical ecosystem. Their presence feels purposeful without being expressive, reinforcing the sense that everything here has a role, even if that role is never described in detail. Life continues, work proceeds, and the mountain remains exactly where it has always been, neither advancing nor retreating, content with its position within the system. There is something almost comforting in this predictability, particularly in a world where uncertainty is often dramatized and instability marketed as excitement. Yamantau offers none of that, presenting instead a steady refusal to participate in spectacle, which can feel unsettling precisely because it is so calm. The mountain does not demand attention, and it does not reward it either, creating a space where curiosity gradually learns to lower its voice. As the minutes pass and the focus remains external, it becomes clear that understanding Yamantau does not require access, only observation of how consistently it remains out of reach. Its significance lies not in what might be beneath the stone, but in how effectively the surface discourages engagement without ever appearing hostile. This is not a place that repels, but one that gently insists on distance, making absence feel like the most natural response. By the end of this quiet interval, the mountain stands unchanged, stable in both form and function, continuing its routine without acknowledgement of those who notice it from afar. It does not react to attention, nor does it respond to speculation, because neither has any impact on its operation. In that way, Yamantau becomes less a subject to be solved and more an example of how some places are designed not for discovery, but for persistence, existing comfortably in silence, upheld by systems that do not require explanation, and surrounded by a calm that feels deliberate, practiced, and entirely complete. The city without visitors. Not far from the quiet slopes of Mount Yamantau, where stone and administration seem to have reached a long-standing agreement, there exists a town that feels less like a destination and more like a carefully maintained condition. Mejgori does not announce itself to travelers because travelers are not expected, and it does not appear on the mental maps people build when imagining places worth seeing. It is a city without visitors by design, not because it is hostile or dramatic, but because it has simply been arranged to function without the concept of outside interest ever becoming relevant. At first glance, Mejgori looks reassuringly ordinary, which may be its most effective quality. Apartment buildings stand in predictable rows, schools open and close according to schedule, shops supply what is needed without excess, and streets follow routines that feel comfortably repetitive. Nothing here suggests urgency, secrecy, or theatrical importance, and nothing asks to be photographed, admired, or explained. The town does not perform identity because identity, like tourism, would require an audience. Life inside Mejgori unfolds at a pace that feels deliberately unremarkable, with days structured around work, school, and rest, in patterns that rarely deviate. Children attend classes, adults commute, errands are completed, and evenings settle into quiet predictability, creating an atmosphere where stability is not an achievement, but a baseline expectation. This consistency is not accidental, because in places like this, surprise is less a pleasure and more a logistical inconvenience, best avoided altogether. What distinguishes Mejgori is not the absence of life, but the absence of contact, because the town is not isolated in the geographical sense, but separated administratively, wrapped in procedures that define who belongs and who does not. Entry is regulated not through spectacle, but through paperwork, permissions, and systems that operate efficiently enough to feel invisible. There are no dramatic confrontations at the edges, only the calm understanding that access is neither spontaneous nor negotiable, and that understanding tends to be enough. Residents adapt to this structure with a pragmatism that feels learned rather than imposed, because when boundaries are consistent, they gradually fade into the background of daily life. Over time, the absence of outsiders becomes normal, and normality, once established, requires very little justification. The town does not miss visitors because it was never designed to accommodate them, and longing rarely develops for what has never been part of the routine. There is a subtle, almost gentle irony in how self-sufficient the town appears, because everything necessary for ordinary life exists within its controlled perimeter. Education, housing, healthcare, and employment are arranged to minimize dependence on the outside, creating a closed loop of activity that sustains itself quietly. The result is a place where life feels complete without expansion, a concept that feels increasingly unfamiliar in a world that often equates growth with success. Mejgori's calmness is reinforced by its visual language, which avoids both austerity and ornamentation, settling instead into a neutral aesthetic that communicates function rather than aspiration. Buildings are maintained, not celebrated. Public spaces are practical, not symbolic, and nothing appears designed to provoke emotion. This visual restraint mirrors the town's social rhythm, where expression is private, routine is public, and everything operates within clearly understood limits. The lack of publicity surrounding the town is not framed as secrecy so much as irrelevance, as though explanation were unnecessary for something that already works. Official descriptions, when encountered, tend to emphasize normalcy, employment, and infrastructure, offering just enough information to satisfy administrative requirements without encouraging further inquiry. The effect is not mystery, but mild boredom, which turns out to be a remarkably effective deterrent to curiosity. From a broader perspective, Mejgori functions as a buffer, a soft outer layer that absorbs attention while allowing whatever lies beyond it to remain undisturbed. This role does not require residents to be guardians or participants in any larger narrative, only inhabitants of a space that exists to be stable, predictable, and largely ignored. In this way, the town performs its function simply by continuing to exist exactly as it does, day after day, without deviation. The routines of the town reinforce this stability, as schedules repeat with minimal variation and seasonal changes are acknowledged without ceremony. Winter arrives, heating systems engage, daily life adjusts, and nothing about this transition is treated as exceptional. Summer follows, routines shift slightly, and the cycle continues, creating a temporal rhythm that discourages reflection and rewards consistency. It is easy to imagine how over time the controlled environment shapes perception, teaching residents to value continuity over novelty and reliability over excitement. In such a setting, curiosity does not disappear, but it becomes quieter, more internal, less inclined toward disruption. The town does not suppress imagination. It simply gives it fewer external surfaces to attach itself to. There is also a peculiar comfort in how little Mejgori asks of those who live there beyond participation in routine. Expectations are clear, boundaries stable, and uncertainty minimized, which can feel restful in a world that often demands constant adaptation. The town offers a version of life where the rules do not change often, and when they do, the changes are communicated without drama. From the outside, Mejgori is often described as a closed city, a term that implies exclusion, but from within, it may feel more like a place that has quietly opted out of being observed. The difference is subtle but significant, because opting out suggests agency rather than restriction, a choice to remain unremarkable rather than a need to be hidden. Whether that perception aligns with reality is less important than the fact that the town functions smoothly without resolving the question. As we continue to observe from a respectful distance, Mejgorje reveals itself not as a riddle demanding answers, but as an environment optimized for continuity. Its streets do not lead toward revelation, its buildings do not hint at secrets, and its routines do not invite interpretation. Instead, the town exists as a lived-in pause, a steady, inhabited silence that cushions whatever lies beyond it. By the end of this segment, the image that remains is not one of tension or concealment, but of a community moving through time at a controlled, even pace, largely untouched by external attention. Mejgorje does not resist observation so much as it renders observation unnecessary, continuing its daily rhythms without interruption. In doing so, it demonstrates that the most effective barriers are not always walls or warnings, but ordinary lives lived within clearly drawn boundaries, quietly sustaining a place that was never meant to receive guests. The storage beneath the city. Beneath a city that appears compact, ceremonial, and carefully arranged above ground, there stretches a quieter world made not of streets or plazas, but of corridors designed to last longer than memory. These underground passages do not invite wandering, and they do not reward curiosity with spectacle, because their purpose is neither exploration nor revelation. They exist to hold, to stabilize, and to remain consistent, performing the unglamorous work of preservation with a patience that does not depend on attention. The first thing one would notice, if observation were permitted for long enough, is how little changes down here. Temperature remains steady, humidity controlled to a degree that borders on obsessive, and lighting calibrated to be sufficient without being generous. Nothing flickers, nothing surprises, and nothing attempts to be atmospheric because atmosphere is unnecessary when function has already been perfected. The space does not attempt to feel ancient or important. It simply feels correct, as though deviation would be a form of carelessness. Along these corridors, documents rest in arrangements that prioritize longevity over accessibility, ordered not to be read frequently, but to survive intact. Millions of pages exist in this state of readiness without expectation, waiting not for discovery, but for continued stability. Their presence is quiet, almost stubbornly so, because paper does not ask to be consulted, and ink does not require acknowledgement to remain meaningful. The archive does not insist that its contents be understood. It only insists that they be kept. Access to these materials is limited, but not for reasons that align neatly with popular imagination. The restrictions do not function as a dramatic barrier guarding hidden truths, but as a practical response to fragility. Paper ages, bindings weaken, and excessive handling accelerates decay, which means that limitation is less about secrecy and more about restraint. In this environment, withholding access is an act of maintenance rather than control, a decision rooted in material reality rather than narrative tension. There is something gently ironic in how often these archives are described as mysterious, when in practice they operate with a transparency that feels almost indifferent. Their rules are published, their purpose stated plainly, and their procedures documented thoroughly, leaving little room for intrigue beyond the unavoidable fact that not everything can be handled at once. Mystery thrives on uncertainty, but here, uncertainty has been replaced by protocol, and protocol has a way of draining drama from even the most elaborate expectations. The corridors themselves reflect this philosophy, extending in calm repetition without visual emphasis, as though designed to discourage emotional attachment. Shelving stretches predictably, labels perform their function quietly, and the architecture avoids flourish in favor of endurance. These are not spaces built to inspire awe, because awe encourages lingering, and lingering introduces risk. Instead, everything here communicates a subtle invitation to move carefully, slowly, and only when necessary. What rests within these walls is not arranged as a narrative because narratives imply progression, climax, and conclusion, concepts that are irrelevant to storage. The documents are not assembled to tell a story, but to exist as individual records, each complete in its own stillness. History, in this form, does not advance or retreat. It simply remains available under controlled conditions, which is a far less dramatic arrangement than most people expect. The absence of urgency is perhaps the most striking feature of the space because nothing here demands immediate attention. No deadline looms, no revelation waits impatiently, and no moment feels decisive. Time behaves differently underground, stretching into a slow continuum where decades pass without altering the daily routine. In such an environment, history is not an active force, but a stored one, carefully insulated from the pressures of interpretation. This approach reframes the relationship between knowledge and access in a way that can feel unsettling to modern sensibilities, which often equate availability with value. Here, value is measured by survival, not circulation, and importance is defined by the ability to remain intact rather than the frequency of consultation. The documents do not lose significance by being unread, they preserve it by remaining unchanged. There is also a quiet discipline in how the archive resists reinterpretation, not through prohibition, but through passivity. The papers do not argue, the shelves do not explain, and the corridors do not guide understanding. Meaning is not presented. It must be approached carefully, deliberately, and within boundaries that prioritize preservation over satisfaction. This can feel frustrating to those accustomed to instant clarity, but frustration is not a concern the archive is designed to address. From a distance, the archive functions less as a vault of secrets and more as a buffer between the past and the present, absorbing curiosity while releasing very little energy in return. It holds history in a suspended state, neither advancing it nor erasing it, allowing time to pass without demanding interpretation. This suspended quality gives the space its distinctive calm, a sense that nothing here is waiting for resolution. The humor, if it can be called that, lies in how ordinary the work becomes once stripped of its reputation. Staff move through routines, checks are performed, records maintained, and the system continues without acknowledging the myths that surround it. The archive does not correct misconceptions, because doing so would require engagement, and engagement would imply a need to be understood. Silence, in this context, is not defensive. It is efficient. As the minutes drift by, the realization settles that this underground world does not exist to reveal or conceal, but to endure. Its success is measured not in discoveries made, but in documents preserved, a metric that favors patience over excitement. The archive does not compete for relevance, because relevance changes too quickly, and paper does not benefit from urgency. By the end of this segment, the image that remains is one of stillness carefully engineered, a place where history is allowed to rest without commentary. The corridors continue, the climate remains stable, and the shelves hold their contents without expectation. Nothing needs to be read immediately, nothing needs to be explained tonight, and nothing is lost by leaving it undisturbed. In this quiet underground system, history is not hidden, dramatized, or celebrated. It is simply kept, which turns out to be one of the most unsettling arrangements of all, because it suggests that the past does not require our attention to continue existing, only our restraint. The quiet desert. In the center of a desert that seems to have perfected the art of not reacting, a cluster of white domes rests against the horizon with a confidence that feels almost excessive for something that rarely speaks for itself. Pine Gap does not rise dramatically, does not attempt to blend in, and does not offer visual complexity, because complexity would imply expression, and expression is unnecessary here. The domes sit calmly on the dry ground, smooth and uniform, as though they have been placed not to impress the landscape, but to coexist with its indifference. The desert surrounding Pine Gap is wide enough to make scale feel irrelevant, stretching outward until distance itself becomes the dominant feature. The ground is dry, firm, and unremarkable, while the sky above expands with a steadiness that discourages urgency. There are no natural interruptions demanding attention, no sudden changes that suggest drama, and no sounds that linger long enough to feel personal. This environment does not rush, and Pine Gap seems to have learned that lesson well. At first glance, the facility appears almost gentle, its white surfaces reflecting sunlight without glare, and its rounded forms avoiding sharpness. Nothing here suggests aggression or urgency, and nothing demands interpretation. The domes do not open, gesture, or acknowledge those who notice them from afar, because acknowledgement would imply interaction, and interaction is not part of the design. Instead, the structures remain sealed, complete, and resolutely uninterested in participation. Inside these quiet shells, systems operate continuously, following rhythms that do not align with day or night, weather or season. Signals are received, processed, and passed along with a consistency that borders on ritual, though ritual would imply symbolism, and this is purely procedural. The work does not pause for reflection, and it does not accelerate for excitement, because the value of the system lies in its stability rather than its responsiveness. There is a particular calm that comes from automation perfected over time, where processes become so reliable that they no longer require attention beyond maintenance. Pine Gap embodies this calm, functioning less like a command center and more like a long-term condition that simply exists. Nothing about the facility suggests a need to be explained publicly, because explanation would not improve its operation, and curiosity would only add noise to a system optimized for clarity. The absence of sound is not total, but it is carefully managed, reduced to background hums that never rise into awareness unless one listens deliberately. Wind moves across the desert, air circulates within controlled environments, and machines continue their work without announcing it. This quiet is not emptiness but efficiency, a reduction of unnecessary signals that allows the essential ones to pass through unchallenged. From the outside, Pine Gap appears static, unchanged year after year, as though frozen in a permanent present. This impression is misleading only in the sense that activity does occur, but it occurs inwardly, invisibly, and without narrative. There are no milestones to mark, no events to commemorate, and no transitions worth announcing. The facility does not progress in stages. It persists. The surrounding desert amplifies this sense of persistence because deserts are not impressed by intention. They accept structures without reacting to them, absorbing footprints and fading disturbances with practiced ease. In this context, Pine Gap feels less like an intrusion and more like a temporary agreement between technology and terrain, one that lasts only as long as maintenance continues and interest remains sustained elsewhere. There is a mild irony in how visually distinctive the domes are while remaining emotionally neutral, because their appearance attracts attention without rewarding it. They are memorable shapes that refuse to provide context, which can feel faintly humorous in a restrained way, as though the landscape itself were quietly amused by how little the structures reveal, despite their visibility. The domes seem to say everything and nothing at once, which is perhaps the most efficient form of communication available. The facility does not require interaction from its surroundings, because its relationship with space extends far beyond the visible horizon. Signals arrive from distances that make the desert seem intimate by comparison, connecting Pine Gap to networks that exist entirely outside local geography. And yet, despite this vast reach, the physical presence remains understated, as though deliberately minimizing its footprint in human attention, even while engaging with systems that span continents. Daily life near Pine Gap, where it exists at all, adjusts to this quiet permanence without ceremony. Routines develop, expectations stabilize, and the extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. Over time, the facility becomes part of the background, a constant that no longer demands explanation, much like the desert itself. When something exists long enough without change, it stops being questioned and starts being assumed. This assumption is perhaps the most effective form of invisibility because it removes the need for defense or justification. Pine Gap does not hide, it simply continues, relying on consistency rather than secrecy to maintain its position. In doing so, it demonstrates how endurance can be more effective than concealment, especially in environments where attention naturally drifts toward movement and novelty. As the minutes pass and observation remains distant, the facility's role becomes clearer not through revelation, but through absence. Nothing dramatic happens, nothing resolves, and nothing demands interpretation. The domes remain where they are, the systems continue their work, and the desert maintains its silence without comment. By the end of this segment, Pine Gap feels less like a place and more like a sustained pause, an intersection where technology and emptiness have agreed to coexist without drawing attention to the arrangement. The ground stays dry, the sky remains vast, and the quiet stretches on uninterrupted. There is no need for interaction, no requirement for explanation, and no expectation of closure. In this silent desert, stability becomes the defining feature, and the absence of narrative becomes the most unsettling element of all, because it suggests that some systems function best when they are noticed just enough to be acknowledged and never enough to be understood. The isolated island. In the middle of the Indian Ocean, far from shipping lanes that inspire curiosity and far from coastlines that invite return, lies a coral atoll that appears almost deliberately gentle. Diego Garcia does not rise dramatically from the sea, nor does it challenge the horizon with cliffs or peaks, because it has no interest in appearing formidable. Its shape is low, curved, and contained, a ring of land holding a lagoon that reflects the sky with quiet cooperation. From above, it looks peaceful enough to forget, which may be the most effective form of isolation ever engineered. The ocean surrounding the island performs much of the work that walls usually do, extending outward in all directions with a consistency that discourages casual arrival. Water, unlike fences, does not announce boundaries, but it enforces them reliably, requiring time, intention, and permission to cross. The waves arrive in steady rhythms, the wind remains polite, and nothing in the landscape suggests urgency or invitation. It is not a place that resists attention aggressively. It simply offers no reason to linger mentally once it has been acknowledged. There is no tourism here, no infrastructure designed to welcome curiosity, and no narrative crafted for outsiders. Beaches exist, but not for leisure. Paths exist, but not for wandering. And buildings exist, but only to support routine. Everything on the island feels purposeful, without being expressive, as though decoration would be an unnecessary distraction, in a space optimized for control through simplicity. The absence of spectacle is so complete that it almost feels intentional, a decision to remain visually unremarkable in a world that equates beauty with accessibility. Movement on and around Diego Garcia is regulated quietly, through schedules and permissions that do not raise questions because they rarely need to be explained. Arrival is deliberate, departure is planned, and nothing about the process suggests spontaneity. This predictability creates an environment where surprise feels out of place and curiosity loses momentum before it has a chance to settle. The island does not refuse visitors dramatically. It simply never expects them. The lagoon at the center of the atoll remains calm more often than not, protected by the coral ring that absorbs the ocean's restlessness. This natural containment mirrors the administrative structure imposed upon the island, reinforcing the sense that everything here is held gently but firmly in place. Nature and procedure align without conflict, creating a space where control feels almost organic, as though the island itself had agreed to its role long before anyone noticed. Life on the island, where it exists, follows routines that emphasize continuity over variation. Days pass with little distinction, marked more by maintenance schedules than by events. The climate changes subtly, the light shifts predictably, and the environment remains cooperative enough to require minimal adjustment. This stability is not exciting, but it is effective, and effectiveness in places like this is valued far more than stimulation. There is a quiet irony in how serene the island appears, because serenity is often associated with escape, while here it functions as insulation. The calm discourages questions, the beauty diffuses tension, and the isolation reduces the need for explanation. When nothing seems dramatic, nothing feels urgent, and urgency is the one thing that might attract sustained attention. Diego Garcia remains undisturbed not because it is hidden, but because it is tranquil enough to fade from imagination. From a distance, the island feels less like a location and more like a condition, a stable point in the ocean where systems operate without needing to be acknowledged. Its significance does not announce itself, and it does not compete for relevance. Instead, it persists, supported by geography that favors separation and routines that reinforce it. The island does not invite interpretation, it merely exists. The surrounding sea reinforces this existence by behaving exactly as expected, offering no dramatic storms to mark time and no unusual calm to inspire reflection. Waves arrive, retreat, and repeat, performing the same motion they have always performed. In this context, change feels unnecessary, and stillness becomes the defining feature. The ocean does not question the island's presence, and the island does not respond. There is a subtle humor in how completely the island avoids being interesting in the conventional sense, because it possesses all the elements that typically attract attention: clear water, open skies, remote beauty, while simultaneously denying their usual purpose. It is a reminder that aesthetics do not automatically invite access, and that beauty, when stripped of narrative, can function as a barrier rather than an invitation. Over time, this arrangement proves remarkably durable as the lack of interaction becomes self-sustaining. The fewer people think about the island, the less they expect from it, and the less they expect, the easier it is for the island to remain exactly as it is. Isolation, once established, requires very little reinforcement when geography and routine cooperate so effectively. As the minutes pass and observation remains distant, Diego Garcia settles into the background of the oceanic expanse, a place acknowledged briefly and then mentally released. There is nothing to resolve here, no story demanding completion, and no detail requiring closer inspection. The island does not need to be understood to function, and understanding would add little to its operation. By the end of this segment, the image that lingers is one of calm persistence, an atoll surrounded by water that performs its role as a natural boundary with effortless consistency. Waves remain steady, winds remain light, and the landscape remains unchanged. There is nothing that requires closer observation, and nothing that rewards it. In this isolated island, control is maintained not through confrontation or secrecy, but through distance, routine, and a tranquility so complete that it quietly discourages attention, proving that sometimes the most effective way to remain untouched is simply to appear at rest. The old laboratory. In the gently folded countryside of southern England, where fields seem content to repeat themselves and roads curve without urgency, there exists a research site that has learned how to disappear through familiarity. Porton Down does not interrupt the landscape, because interruption would require attention, and attention would complicate a place designed to operate without commentary. The buildings sit low against the ground, spaced generously apart, arranged in a way that suggests patience rather than ambition, as though the entire site had been planned with the assumption that nothing needed to happen quickly. From a distance, the complex looks almost pastoral, surrounded by open land that absorbs sound and softens edges. There are no towers announcing purpose, no dramatic silhouettes, and no architectural gestures meant to communicate importance. Instead, the layout emphasizes separation, clear lines of sight, and an absence of congestion, creating an environment where movement feels deliberate and predictable. Everything appears prepared for routine rather than event, which immediately lowers expectations and encourages a kind of observational calm. Security here is present, but it does not perform itself, relying instead on consistency and procedure. Boundaries are clear without being theatrical, monitored without spectacle, and maintained with a regularity that becomes part of the background. Nothing suggests alarm, and nothing invites testing, because the system does not rely on confrontation to assert itself. It simply exists, repeating its processes day after day, confident that repetition alone is sufficient. The buildings themselves reinforce this philosophy, favoring practicality over expression and longevity over novelty. Their designs are modest, functional, and refreshingly uninterested in trends, which gives them an almost timeless quality. They neither age dramatically nor adapt visibly, existing in a state of steady adequacy that resists both decay and excitement. This architectural restraint communicates a clear message. The work done here does not require visual explanation. Inside, spaces are arranged around workflows that prioritize control and predictability, with corridors, rooms, and equipment positioned to support processes that have been refined through long use. Everything is calibrated, documented, and checked, not because of urgency, but because routine demands precision. The environment does not encourage improvisation, and it does not reward curiosity beyond what procedure allows, creating a setting where stability becomes the primary measure of success. Time behaves differently in such a place, stretching into cycles defined by maintenance schedules, inspections, and renewals, rather than milestones or breakthroughs. Progress, when it occurs, is incremental and quiet, integrated seamlessly into existing systems without announcement. There are no grand moments to mark, no transformations to celebrate, and no narratives to construct, which allows the site to continue operating without interruption or explanation. There is a mild irony in how unremarkable the site appears given its longevity, because endurance often attracts myth, yet Porton Down resists dramatization through sheer ordinariness. The land around it remains agricultural, the roads remain narrow, and the rhythm of the area remains unchanged, as though the presence of the research site had been carefully balanced to avoid disturbing its surroundings. This balance is not accidental. It is a form of design that values coexistence over dominance. The absence of sudden movement contributes significantly to the atmosphere, as nothing here seems to react impulsively. Vehicles arrive and depart according to schedule, personnel move between buildings without haste, and systems transition smoothly from one state to another. The predictability of these motions creates a sense of calm that feels both reassuring and faintly unsettling, because unpredictability is often mistaken for vitality, while stability can feel strangely impersonal. Over decades, repetition becomes the defining characteristic of the space, shaping not only procedures but perception itself. When actions repeat reliably, they fade from conscious awareness, allowing the site to function without drawing attention to itself. This invisibility is not secrecy but familiarity, a condition in which the extraordinary becomes ordinary through persistence alone. The surrounding openness plays a subtle role in reinforcing this condition, as wide spaces absorb both sound and significance. Distances between buildings reduce interaction to what is necessary, and the landscape provides a buffer that softens the site's presence. Nothing feels compressed or urgent, and nothing suggests that change is imminent, creating an environment where continuity is not only expected, but assumed. There is a restrained humor in how thoroughly the site avoids being interesting, because it embodies all the qualities that popular imagination tends to overlook. Low buildings do not inspire speculation. Routine does not invite fascination, and repetition does not generate headlines. The result is a place that continues its work undisturbed, precisely because it does not compete for attention in a culture that thrives on novelty. As observation continues from a respectful distance, it becomes clear that Porton Down is less a single location than a sustained practice, a commitment to process that values reliability over visibility. The site does not need to be explained publicly to justify its existence because it operates within frameworks that assume their own necessity. Explanation, in this context, would be redundant. By the end of this segment, the image that remains is one of quiet persistence, a landscape of low structures and wide spaces accustomed to repetition. Nothing dramatic occurs, nothing changes abruptly, and nothing demands interpretation. The laboratory remains what it has always been, a place where systems run, procedures repeat, and time passes without ceremony. In this old laboratory, the absence of surprise becomes the defining feature, gently unsettling in its consistency and oddly calming in its refusal to hurry, reminding us that some spaces are designed not to evolve visibly, but to continue doing exactly what they have always done, without interruption and without explanation. Where nature stands guard. Deep beneath the surface of northern Mexico, far below sunlight and far beyond the reach of casual movement, there exists a chamber that does not require fences, schedules, or instructions in order to remain undisturbed. The cave of the crystals rests inside the earth with a confidence that comes from geological patience, not human planning, and its effectiveness as a protected space lies entirely in conditions that cannot be negotiated. The heat is constant, the humidity unyielding, and the environment itself quietly determines how long presence is possible, which turns the cave into a place guarded not by authority but by physics. Entering this underground space is not dramatic in the cinematic sense because nothing announces itself with sound or motion. The crystals do not shimmer theatrically, and the chamber does not echo with significance, as though the cave had learned long ago that spectacle invites attention, while stillness discourages it. Massive crystalline structures extend from floor and ceiling in slow, deliberate geometries, filling the space without leaving room for comfort. And they do so without any awareness of observation. The air inside the cave carries warmth that feels immediate and inescapable, wrapping around the body with a density that makes time behave differently. Movement slows, not because of instruction, but because exertion becomes impractical, and breathing itself demands awareness. This is not an environment designed for exploration, and it does not pretend otherwise. The cave does not welcome visitors, but it does not reject them either, because rejection would imply intention, and the cave operates entirely without it. The crystals themselves dominate the space with a presence that feels both precise and indifferent, growing over immense periods through processes that had no awareness of human schedules. Their scale is impressive not because it seeks admiration, but because scale is the natural outcome of uninterrupted time. Each crystal remains exactly where it formed, unchanged by interpretation, and unconcerned with how it might be understood. There are no signs here explaining significance, no pathways guiding safe passage, and no barriers preventing contact, because none of those measures are necessary. The temperature and humidity perform all required regulation, quietly enforcing limits without confrontation. The cave does not rely on warnings because the conditions themselves make prolonged presence unsustainable, and unsustainable presence tends to resolve itself without intervention. This natural form of control carries a subtle irony because it achieves what many guarded spaces attempt through layers of administration, doing so without effort or maintenance. No schedules need to be adjusted, no personnel rotated, and no systems monitored, because the cave maintains its own equilibrium. Stability here is not enforced. It is inherent. The stillness inside the chamber feels complete rather than empty, as though nothing is missing and nothing is waiting to happen. Water once played a role in shaping this space, but even that movement has long since settled into absence, leaving behind a silence that feels earned. The crystals stand as records of conditions that no longer exist, preserved not through intervention, but through continuity. From a human perspective, the cave's inaccessibility can feel almost dismissive because it offers no compromise between safety and proximity. One does not negotiate with heat, and one does not persuade humidity, which means that presence must remain brief and carefully managed. The cave sets its terms without explanation, and those terms are final. There is a restrained humor in how thoroughly the cave ignores the concept of protection as humans understand it. Where fences would be expensive and guards would be impractical, temperature performs flawlessly. Where policies might change, physics remains consistent. The cave demonstrates that the most effective barriers are often those that do not announce themselves as barriers at all. The crystals continue to occupy the space without regard for observation, growing when conditions allow and resting when they do not, entirely unaffected by human interest. Their surfaces remain clear, their forms intact, and their arrangement unchanged, because the environment discourages the very activity that might alter them. Preservation here is not an active process, It is a side effect of inhospitable comfort. As time passes in this underground chamber, awareness shifts from curiosity to endurance, and from endurance to acceptance that nothing here is meant to be engaged with for long. The cave does not offer a story to follow, nor does it provide a lesson to extract. It simply exists as it always has, maintaining conditions that make intrusion impractical rather than forbidden. The surrounding rock reinforces this sense of permanence, enclosing the chamber in layers that have absorbed pressure for millions of years without complaint. The earth does not hurry and it does not reconsider, which gives the cave a calm authority that feels absolute. There is no sense of urgency here, no countdown, and no progression toward resolution, because the space has already reached equilibrium. By the end of this segment, the cave remains unchanged, its crystals steady, its air heavy, and its silence complete. Nothing has been disturbed, and nothing needs to be restored, because the environment itself has ensured continuity. There are no guards to thank, no systems to credit, and no explanations to offer. In this place, nature performs the role of protector without ceremony, demonstrating that some spaces remain intact not because they are defended, but because they quietly remind us of our limits, allowing everything within them to stay exactly as it is. The modern vault. Beneath the surface of the American landscape carved out of rock that once existed only to be removed, there is a space that has quietly changed purpose without changing temperament. What was once a limestone mine has been repurposed into something far less visible and far more patient, a vast underground environment where modern memory is not displayed, interpreted, or revisited, but simply kept. Iron Mountain does not attempt to feel historic or futuristic, because either would suggest narrative, and narrative is unnecessary. In a place designed for endurance rather than meaning. The first sensation such a space would offer, if one were inclined to notice sensations at all, is stability. Temperature remains consistent to a degree that feels almost indifferent to the weather above. Humidity is managed without fluctuation, and air circulates quietly through corridors that stretch far beyond what the surface geography would suggest. This constancy is not impressive in the dramatic sense, but it is effective, and effectiveness here matters far more than inspiration. The underground scale is difficult to grasp without reference because width and distance behave differently when the sky is no longer present. Hallways extend calmly, storage rooms open without emphasis, and the rock itself absorbs sound in a way that discourages urgency. There is no echo demanding attention, no acoustics encouraging speech, and no visual landmarks designed to orient emotion. The space does not ask to be remembered. It asks only to continue. Within this controlled environment, materials of many kinds rest together without hierarchy. Documents sit alongside film reels, magnetic tapes coexist with digital storage systems, and records of wildly different eras share the same conditions without comment. Nothing here argues for relevance, and nothing competes for attention, because relevance is temporary and attention is corrosive. Preservation, in contrast, requires neutrality. What makes this arrangement quietly unsettling is how intentionally disengaged it feels from interpretation. The contents are not stored in order to be admired, nor are they arranged to be accessed casually. They are here to remain intact, to outlast changing formats, shifting priorities, and the steady erosion of interest that affects most human creations. Viewing is optional, but survival is mandatory. There is a restrained irony in how much effort is invested in ensuring that these materials never need to be looked at again. Systems are maintained, redundancies installed, and protocols refined, all in service of a future that may never arrive in the form imagined. The assumption is not that someone will come searching for meaning, but that someone might one day need confirmation that something once existed and that confirmation should still be possible. Unlike traditional archives that invite scholarly engagement, this modern vault resists romance through efficiency. Nothing is handwritten for sentiment, nothing is arranged aesthetically, and nothing is preserved because it feels important in the moment. Importance here is assigned retroactively, which is a remarkably humbling way to organize memory. The present does not decide what matters. It simply keeps everything long enough for the future to decide instead. The former mine itself plays an essential role in this philosophy because rock is an honest material that does not pretend to be temporary. Its weight discourages improvisation, its thickness absorbs external instability, and its age puts human timelines into quiet perspective. The mind does not care what is stored within it, which turns out to be a perfect trait for a place tasked with holding the residue of countless human decisions. Daily operations inside Iron Mountain follow routines that feel almost ceremonial in their repetition, though ceremony would imply symbolism, and this is closer to maintenance. Checks are performed, systems are tested, and environments are adjusted with calm precision, not because something is expected to go wrong, but because nothing should. Stability is not assumed, it is continuously reinforced. The absence of urgency becomes the defining feature of the space because nothing here needs immediate resolution. Files do not demand to be read, films do not insist on projection, and data does not seek interpretation. Everything waits without expectation, suspended in a condition of readiness that may never be activated. This waiting is not tense, it is practiced. There is something faintly humorous in how human anxiety about loss has produced spaces so profoundly uninterested in engagement. We fear forgetting, so we build places designed for remembering without remembering actively. We worry about disappearance, so we create environments where nothing is required to appear. Iron Mountain embodies this contradiction with admirable consistency. Above ground, time continues noisily, with trends, updates, and constant revision, while below ground, time stretches into something slower and less reactive. The contrast is not announced, but it is complete. The underground does not argue with the surface, it simply outlasts it. In doing so, it becomes a quiet commentary on how temporary urgency really is. As observation remains distant and conceptual, the vault reveals itself not as a monument to memory, but as an infrastructure of restraint. It does not curate meaning, and it does not shape narrative. It creates conditions under which meaning might survive long enough to be reconsidered later, if reconsideration ever becomes necessary. By the end of this segment, the impression left is not one of mystery or secrecy, but of calm postponement. A former mind continues to hold the fragments of modern existence without commentary, without preference, and without demand. Nothing needs to be viewed tonight, and nothing needs to be explained. In this modern vault, preservation replaces interpretation, stability replaces urgency, and memory is treated not as something to be celebrated, but as something that simply should not be lost, which may be the most quietly unsettling approach of all. The base inside the mountain. Along the fractured coastline of Sweden's archipelago, where rock meets water with practiced restraint, there is a mountain that has learned how to hold space without advertising it. Musko does not rise with theatrical ambition, nor does it demand recognition from the sea that surrounds it, because its significance was never meant to be measured by height or visibility. The mountain sits where it has always sat, quietly absorbing weather, sound, and attention, while inside it, volume expands in ways the surface never suggests. Within the stone, space opens gradually rather than dramatically, revealing chambers and tunnels, designed not to impress but to endure. Steel doors appear, where one expects rock to continue, heavy and deliberate, shaped less by aesthetics than by the logic of longevity. They do not invite interaction, and they do not rush to close because urgency would imply vulnerability, and vulnerability is not part of the design vocabulary here. The tunnels stretch with a patience that mirrors the mountain itself, long enough to make direction feel abstract and distance feel intentional. Lighting remains consistent, neither harsh nor decorative, calibrated to support movement without encouraging lingering. Sound behaves differently underground, softened by stone and distance, turning even mechanical presence into something subdued. The mountain performs its role well, not by concealing noise aggressively, but by absorbing it calmly. Everything within Musko has been arranged around the principle of durability, a quality that resists fashion and ignores commentary. Materials are chosen for how long they last rather than how they appear, and systems are configured to continue functioning even when attention shifts elsewhere. There is no unnecessary ornamentation, no symbolic flourish, and no attempt to make the space memorable, because memory is unreliable and stone is not. What makes the base particularly effective is how little it asks of the outside world. It does not rely on constant reinforcement of identity or explanation of purpose, because the mountain itself provides continuity. Rock does not need updates, and it does not require reassurance, which allows everything within it to operate with a confidence that feels almost indifferent. The base does not need to remind anyone that it exists. Existence here is assumed. Movement through the interior follows routes that have been refined through repetition, guiding activity without drawing attention to guidance itself. Doors open when required, corridors lead where they must, and transitions occur without emphasis. Nothing about the layout suggests improvisation, because improvisation introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is inefficient. The space feels rehearsed, not in performance, but in reliability. There is a subtle humor in how thoroughly the base avoids spectacle, because carving vast interiors into solid rock is, objectively speaking, an impressive act. And yet nothing about the environment celebrates this effort. The mountain does not congratulate itself, and neither does the infrastructure inside it. Achievement here is treated as a prerequisite rather than a result, something completed long ago and no longer worth mentioning. The relationship between the base and the surrounding landscape is one of quiet cooperation. From the outside, the mountain remains unchanged, continuing to weather seasons without reaction, while inside systems operate according to schedules that do not acknowledge daylight or darkness. The sea nearby moves with predictable rhythms, and the base responds not by adapting constantly, but by remaining stable. Change happens elsewhere. Here, consistency is the objective. Time inside the mountain stretches differently, shaped less by clocks and more by cycles of maintenance and review. Progress is measured in continued functionality rather than milestones, and success is defined by the absence of interruption. Nothing here seeks recognition for working as intended, because working as intended is the only acceptable state. The steel doors and reinforced passages do not communicate threat or drama. They communicate expectation. They expect weight, pressure, and time, and they are prepared to meet all three without complaint. This expectation creates an atmosphere where surprise feels unnecessary and reaction feels out of place. The environment does not anticipate being tested. It assumes persistence. There is a calm authority in this assumption, one that feels distinct from command or control. The base does not assert itself, it simply remains, confident that remaining is enough. In a world accustomed to constant signaling and explanation, this refusal to comment can feel faintly unsettling, because silence leaves no narrative to engage with. As observation continues from outside the mountain, the most striking realization is how completely the base relies on the mountain to do what it has always done. Stone holds, absorbs, and waits. It does not argue, and it does not hurry. By placing essential functions within this environment, the design acknowledges a simple truth. Endurance is easier when borrowed from geology. By the end of this segment, the mountain remains quiet, its interior unchanged, and its exterior unremarkable. Steel doors stay closed without emphasis, tunnels continue their long, deliberate paths, and systems persist without announcement. Nothing needs to be displayed, and nothing needs to be explained. In this base inside the mountain, strength is expressed through restraint, protection through permanence, and silence through cooperation with stone, reminding us that sometimes the most effective structures are those that learn how to let the mountain do most of the work. The bunker beneath the hotel. Beneath a hotel known for polished hallways, steady hospitality, and the reassuring predictability of scheduled check-ins, there exists a second architecture that was never meant to be noticed by those carrying suitcases. The Greenbrier bunker rests below the surface with a patience that feels deliberate, as though it understands that its most important task is not readiness for use, but readiness without use. It was designed not to be dramatic, not to be activated frequently, and certainly not to be remembered vividly, because memory would imply relevance, and relevance would invite questions. The contrast between what appears above and what remains below is quiet rather than ironic, because irony would suggest commentary, and this arrangement prefers neutrality. Above ground, rooms are refreshed, meals are served, and routines repeat with comforting regularity, while below, space waits. Corridors extend without windows, rooms remain furnished without occupants, and systems remain powered without demand. Nothing below insists on being acknowledged by what happens above, and nothing above hints at what lies underneath, which allows both layers to function without interruption. Inside the bunker, the layout follows a logic that prioritizes continuity over comfort, even though comfort is provided in its most basic form. Sleeping quarters exist not to invite rest, but to allow it if required, and meeting rooms are arranged not for debate, but for orderly presence. Chairs remain aligned, surfaces remain clear, and lighting remains functional, creating an environment that feels perpetually prepared and perpetually unused. This balance is not accidental, It is the entire point. The space does not age in the way hotels do because it is not refreshed to appear current. Instead, it persists in a state of careful adequacy, where nothing is allowed to deteriorate and nothing is updated unnecessarily. Time passes differently here, marked not by guests or seasons, but by inspections and maintenance schedules that exist to confirm that nothing has changed. Change, in this context, would represent failure. There is a restrained humor in how thoroughly the bunker commits to readiness without expectation. Everything required for occupancy exists, yet occupancy is never anticipated with enthusiasm. Supplies are stored, systems tested, and pathways kept clear, all in service of a scenario that may never arrive. The bunker does not hope to be needed. It simply refuses to be unprepared, which is a remarkably calm stance to maintain over decades. The rooms themselves feel neutral to the point of anonymity, as though individuality had been deliberately removed to prevent distraction. There are no personal touches, no decorative choices meant to convey warmth, and no cues that suggest long-term habitation. The environment communicates temporary presence even as it prepares for extended use, a contradiction that feels oddly soothing in its consistency. Ventilation hums quietly, power remains stable, and the entire space maintains a level of order that discourages emotional response. Nothing here invites attachment, because attachment complicates evacuation, and nothing suggests permanence, because permanence would imply success. The bunker exists in a state of suspended purpose, fully formed, yet intentionally dormant. Above ground, guests move through public spaces unaware that an alternative version of continuity exists beneath their feet. They attend meetings, retire to rooms, and depart according to schedule, never needing to consider the infrastructure of contingency below. This separation is not deceptive, it is efficient. The hotel does not require awareness of the bunker to function, and the bunker does not require recognition to remain ready. The design reflects a broader philosophy in which preparation is separated from daily life, tucked away where it can remain intact without interfering with routine. The bunker does not seek integration, it seeks isolation from relevance. By staying unused, it succeeds. By remaining intact, it fulfills its role. There is something quietly unsettling in how complete the space feels despite its dormancy. Nothing is missing and nothing is waiting to be installed. The rooms are finished, the systems operational, and the layout final, which leaves no sense of anticipation. Anticipation would imply expectation, and expectation introduces urgency, which the bunker has been carefully designed to avoid. Maintenance becomes the primary activity, a cycle of checking, adjusting, and confirming that readiness remains theoretical. This cycle repeats without narrative, turning preparedness into a form of routine rather than a response to threat. Over time, the bunker becomes less a solution to a problem and more an object lesson in how deeply societies invest in the idea of continuity. The restrained nature of the space also resists myth-making because there is little to exaggerate. It is neither luxurious nor austere, neither welcoming nor forbidding. It simply exists as a parallel infrastructure, complete and quiet, waiting without impatience. The absence of spectacle is so thorough that it becomes the defining characteristic. As observation continues from a conceptual distance, the bunker reveals itself not as a place of urgency, but as a monument to postponement. It does not promise safety or resolution. It promises availability. This promise is modest, practical, and intentionally limited, which makes it unusually durable. By the end of this segment, the image that remains is not one of tension or anticipation, but of stillness carefully preserved. Beneath a functioning hotel, a complete environment remains unused, prepared, and calm. Everything is ready and everything rests. The bunker does not ask to be activated, and it does not signal its presence. It simply stays where it is, complete and quiet, embodying a philosophy in which preparedness is valued not for what it enables, but for how effectively it can remain invisible, reminding us that some of the most carefully designed spaces are those we hope never to need, and therefore never truly wish to see in motion. The seed vault in the ice. On an Arctic island where the ground itself seems undecided about whether it belongs to land or ice, a quiet structure rests inside a mountain that has learned patience far better than any human system ever could. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault does not announce arrival with grandeur, and it does not reward proximity with spectacle because its purpose is not to impress the present. It exists for a future that may never arrive as imagined, and because of that, it is in no hurry to explain itself. The entrance is modest, almost deliberately so, emerging from rock and snow with a restraint that feels practiced. There are no crowds, no queues, and no reason to linger, because lingering would suggest activity, and activity is not the goal here. The structure leads inward, away from weather, away from seasons, and away from urgency, guiding everything that enters into a space where time slows, not symbolically, but physically. Inside the mountain, corridors extend into cold that does not fluctuate for mood or circumstance. Temperature remains low, steady, and unpersuasive, making warmth feel unnecessary and movement feel optional. The air does not invite conversation, and the silence does not wait to be broken, because nothing here benefits from sound. The environment communicates clearly that presence should be brief and purposeful, and then politely concluded. Metal shelving lines the interior spaces with a precision that avoids decoration, holding sealed packages that contain seeds gathered from across the world. Each packet is labeled carefully, not to attract attention, but to ensure recognition if recognition is ever required. The seeds are not displayed, not examined regularly, and not celebrated individually because celebration would imply immediacy, and immediacy would undermine the entire premise. What rests here is not abundance in the visible sense, but potential, carefully paused. The seeds do not grow, do not change, and do not respond to the passing of years, because cold makes waiting efficient. They remain in a condition designed to resist decay, suspended between usefulness and irrelevance, prepared to become essential only if everything else fails quietly enough to make room for them. No one stays here long, and no one is meant to. Human presence is treated as a temporary disturbance, tolerated only for maintenance and organization. There are no living quarters encouraging habitation, no social spaces inviting interaction, and no routines that suggest daily life. The vault is not a workplace. It is a pause button built into a mountain. The silence inside the vault feels complete rather than empty, as though sound itself has been deemed unnecessary overhead. Footsteps are muted, voices discouraged, and time stretches into something less measurable. The absence of conversation is not enforced, but it is strongly implied by the environment, which makes speaking feel inefficient and listening feel redundant. There is a subtle irony in how much global coordination is represented here in such a quiet form. Countless institutions contribute to the contents, countless decisions lead to each sealed packet, and countless futures are theoretically addressed, yet the result is a space that appears almost indifferent to human involvement. Once placed on the shelf, each seed is left alone, treated equally by cold, darkness, and time. The vault does not promise rescue, and it does not offer reassurance in the emotional sense. It does not suggest that everything will be restored or that continuity is guaranteed. It simply ensures that something remains available, if availability becomes necessary. This modesty is perhaps its most unsettling quality, because it refuses to frame itself as a solution, offering instead a contingency without optimism. Outside the mountain, the Arctic landscape continues its slow negotiation with light and darkness, cycling through seasons that stretch perception of time beyond convenience. Snow accumulates, ice shifts, and rock remains where it has always been, reinforcing the idea that stability does not require activity. The vault borrows this stability, embedding itself in an environment that understands waiting instinctively. There is no rush here because rushing would be illogical. The seeds are not meant for tomorrow, next year, or even the next generation. They are meant for a time when urgency has already failed and recovery requires patience rather than speed. By existing at this pace, the vault quietly challenges the assumption that preparation must be dynamic to be effective. Maintenance is minimal, interaction rare, and intervention carefully limited, because the best way to protect what is stored is to disturb it as little as possible. The systems supporting the vault are designed to fade into the background, functioning without demanding attention, much like the seeds themselves. Nothing competes for priority, because priority implies ranking, and ranking implies choice, which is unnecessary here. There is a faint, restrained humor in how little drama surrounds something so often described as essential. The vault does not dramatize its own importance, and it does not correct misconceptions enthusiastically. It simply exists, calm enough to be overlooked, confident enough not to mind. In a world accustomed to urgent messaging, this refusal to insist feels almost rebellious. As the final minutes of this journey unfold, the vault settles into its role as a closing gesture rather than a climax. There is no revelation waiting at the end of the tunnel, no insight demanding reflection, and no action required. The seeds remain sealed, the shelves remain orderly, and the cold remains cooperative. By the end of this segment, what remains is not a sense of fear or hope, but of measured patience. Deep in the ice, inside a mountain that has no interest in headlines, the future is stored without expectation. Nothing needs to happen now, and nothing needs to be decided tonight. The seeds wait, the temperature holds, and time slows to a pace that feels almost geological. In this final guarded place, preparation takes its most understated form, quietly reminding us that not everything preserved is meant to be used, and not everything kept is meant to be revisited, because sometimes the most responsible action is simply to keep something safe, cold, and out of the way, and then leave it alone. What does not need to be witnessed? There are places in this world that do not improve when we arrive, and there are systems that function best when no one is watching closely enough to demand meaning from them. These spaces do not resist attention out of hostility, and they do not retreat out of fear, but because observation is simply unnecessary to their continued existence. They do not ask to be understood, and they do not suffer when they are overlooked, because their purpose was never tied to recognition in the first place. We often assume that presence equals importance, that seeing something confirms its reality, and that attention somehow completes a place. Yet the quiet locations we have passed tonight suggest something else entirely, a different relationship between existence and acknowledgement. They continue whether we look or not, operating with a calm indifference that can feel faintly unsettling, mostly because it reminds us how optional our participation really is. There is a gentle irony in how much effort humans invest in documenting, visiting, and explaining things that were designed to remain stable without intervention. We catalog what does not require commentary, speculate about what does not respond, and narrate systems that function perfectly well in silence. In doing so, we reveal less about the places themselves and more about our discomfort with environments that do not reflect us back. History, contrary to how we often treat it, does not disappear when we stop paying attention. It does not fade simply because we close a book or turn away from a door. Structures remain, records endure, landscapes hold their shapes, and time continues its steady movement without checking whether anyone is keeping track. The past does not demand to be remembered constantly in order to stay intact. It only requires that it not be disturbed unnecessarily. These guarded places demonstrate a quieter form of continuity, one that does not rely on vigilance or drama. They are stable not because they are defended loudly, but because they have been designed, positioned, or conditioned to persist on their own terms. Silence here is not absence. It is maintenance. Stillness is not neglect. It is a strategy refined over long periods of time. There is something oddly reassuring in this realization, particularly in a culture that equates motion with progress and noise with relevance. The idea that some things are healthiest when left alone suggests that restraint can be as valuable as action, and that stepping back can be a form of respect rather than indifference. Not everything needs to be activated, entered, or resolved in order to justify its existence. As this journey slows to a close, nothing asks for conclusion or interpretation. The mountains remain solid, the corridors remain cool, the vaults remain closed, and the ice continues to hold what it was meant to hold. No moment demands significance, and no space requires validation. Everything is exactly where it should be, functioning quietly without our involvement. And so, for tonight, it is enough to acknowledge that some places are complete without us. They do not require witnesses, reactions, or explanations to remain real. They exist best when they are allowed to remain stable, silent, and undisturbed, reminding us that the world does not always need our presence to continue, and that sometimes the most appropriate response is simply to notice gently and then let go.